In this video, we're going to talk about a word that I don't think enough people are talking about, especially in the coaching industry, which is trauma. What you need to understand about it and how to implement it and incorporate it into your business to be successful going forward. Trauma. That's the whole outline for this video. We don't have an outline or necessarily takeaways. My hope is that this conversation increases your awareness. And what you do with that awareness is up to you. If you're a coach, you can use it in your coaching. You can use it to just help you in life. You can take action on it for your own benefit, just as a person, or use it any other way. But it's a conversation that we've been in as a company for a while. And we actually just got off of what turned into a 3-hour call. Wasn't designed to be a 3-hour call, wasn't even designed to be on the agenda of this training, but we started talking about how traumatized our society is and all the things that we as coaches need to understand. That doesn't necessarily mean we need to become trauma coaches. It doesn't mean we need to insert any of this into our coaching, but we have to understand it because we're helping humans. And if the humans are traumatized, then we need to understand to at least some degree so that we can increase our awareness, increase our capacity to help, increase our compassion, increase our ability to serve people. And if we don't understand the people that we're trying to serve, then our ability to serve them is going to be restricted. Now, before we even get into the conversation with any depth, I want to just say this work as it relates to coaching is really reserved for deep transformational coaching. Not all of you want to be transformational coaches. And if that's not the journey that you want to take, then that's cool. You don't really have to deal with, much of this stuff. Although all of your clients are still going to be dealing with trauma. So you can't change that, because if you're helping humans, there's trauma on the other side. So you might not implement this explicitly in your work, but just the awareness of it is important. But the other thing that I really want to be in tune to and upfront about is that this conversation might trigger you because we're talking about trauma. And we'll get into all this in the video, but because we're taught to avoid trauma, a lot of people get triggered by the existence of or the mentioning of trauma. If any of it triggers you, if it makes you feel uncomfortable and you need some support, please, we want to get this in the front of this video. Please click the link where you can book a free coaching call. And that can support you in any way. It's just your own individual journey or how you want to use this as a coach or what pertains to what, what applies to you, etc. Get some of that support. So with that kind of preamble, let's get into the conversation on trauma. So this conversation is really just going to be, off the cuff. What do we want to share with you about the things that we've been learning in our own life, what we're talking about in our coaching communities, and how we think it is going to relate to your journey wherever you are, as a human, as a coach, as a combination of both of those things. So this conversation was born out of our ECCP, an action group. And you don't need to understand the acronyms and all that stuff, but this is the highest level of mastery certification that we offer in our company. And so we were talking with coaches that are committed to deep work, deep transformational work. And one of the things that we do in that particular program is dissect with as much mastery level precision and understanding as we can the human journey, behavior, not just coaching, but what are humans going through? What's the whole scope of human behavior that we can understand? And that's where this conversation was born. And I'm hesitant to have this conversation because it's a deep, truthful conversation that a lot of people don't want to have. I think we as humans are programmed away from everything that we're about to talk about as the answer, meaning that most of us have been programmed explicitly or implicitly that the way to deal with trauma is to avoid it. And if we can avoid it with alcohol, with sex, with drugs, with social media, with success, with shopping, with anything, doesn't matter, pornography, online, offline, eating, sleeping, whatever, we are programmed to avoid trauma as humans. And it's the exact wrong thing for us to be, or a wrong way for us to be programmed when it comes to trauma, because trauma is an embedded, inherent part of the human journey. There's no way to avoid trauma. But I hesitate to have this conversation because a lot of people actually aren't interested in the truth. I think our community is, I think our channel is, I think any of you that watch any of our videos, you're interested in the deep work because you're more of a teacher, you're more of a dissector, you are insecure as a human being, probably, and you can use those insecurities to increase your ability to help people. And if that's you, then you got to understand trauma, how it has produced you as a human, how it produces humans, how we're all dealing with it, how we're responding to it. From a business standpoint, you know, we probably talked for 45 minutes or an hour in our community with how does this relate to your business? For those of you that are trying to get coaching clients, for those of you that are marketing, for those of you that are messaging, yeah, this all works. This all applies rather, because you're messaging to traumatized humans. You're on social media that is using trauma to get the attention of and then re-traumatizing humans. So if on the other end of anything you do is a human, then you've got to understand, at least to some degree, trauma. So actually, I want to know, is this a conversation that you're interested in? You know, of course, we're going to see how many people watch the video and all those metrics and stuff like that. But I want to know if this is a deep conversation that you are interested in, because there's so much to talk about. You know, we could make a series of videos, and I don't want to do it if obviously, you know, the people in the community aren't necessarily interested in this, you know? So if you just like, hey, just teach me how to get clients and don't talk to me about why those prospects are traumatized and why I should care about it. So like, just teach me how to get clients and teach me how to grow my business. Then let us know that. And first of all, I'll probably refer you to other channels if that's what you want. But in all genuineness, I want to know if this is a conversation that you are interested in, so that we know how deep we want to go and how many videos we want to do to serve the interests of the community. So just let me know in the comment section here what your level of interest is. And if there's anything specific in the conversation around trauma that you want us to address, then let us know that too, and we'll do our best to do it. So having said all of that, what do you want to add?
How do you define it? Because I think that's a big problem, is that a lot of us, I was in a conversation with my wife just yesterday, and we're speaking about fear and fear of success. And she was like, yeah, you know, I don't have any of this because I don't have any traumas.
Right. For the sake of this conversation, this is not the, I forget what it's called, DMSR or something like that. You know, yeah, the official diagnostic definition.
Sure.
It's really just a working definition based on my experiences, and I know your experiences in deep coaching. So my working definition for the sake of this discussion of trauma is adversity. Really, it's any time that our expectations are not met, It's anytime that we need to pivot. It's anytime that something feels unsafe. So when we have any of these unexpected experiences, it's trauma. Now, I think trauma is a spectrum. I don't think trauma is a category. For your wife to say what she said means there's a category, and she's saying, I don't have any of that stuff that qualifies for that category, meaning there's a set of conditions. And her working definition, which is fine, like, I think there are conditions for that box that she was referring to. I just don't think trauma is the right label to use. There's a certain set of, like, extreme trauma maybe that I think she's talking about. But trauma is a spectrum of the human experience. So I was nearly killed by a car when I was 13 years old. That was a traumatic experience. It was a near-death experience. So that might qualify in a lot of people's definitions of trauma. You think about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. We use that label, and we hear that label used primarily for people that have been in war, people that have experienced maybe extreme abuse, people that have gone through some of those extreme behaviors. But I think we all have PTSD. The degree of depth and intensity is what differs. So my parents were divorced. That was a traumatic event. I had to, like, re-engage into my childhood after my accident with a broken leg and had to get back on the baseball field. And I was nothing like I was before. That's a traumatic event. I moved, I think, 3 times during my schools, during my elementary and up through high school. Those are potentially traumatic events. I had all the experiences that I had with my mom, with my dad, with my friends, with bullying, with fights. Those are all traumatic events. To my knowledge, to my consciousness, I was not abused. I wasn't in any kind of scenario that would probably qualify me as having been a trauma survivor. But I've been traumatized in the overall open definition of my life experiences. And with that definition, so have you, and so has every single person that's watching this or listening to this, because trauma is a part of the human journey. And it all starts with birth, and we'll get into that here, I'm sure, in a moment. But if we have that as the working definition of trauma, then we need to understand that all of our past experiences, all of our beliefs, all of our patterns, all of our identities, all of our values, everything that has contributed to our unique recipe as an individual human is based on trauma. It's based on something not going the way we wanted it to, and then having to deal with that. But then we try to protect ourselves with defense mechanisms that will avoid that in the future. So a working example that I think a lot of people can relate to is your first relationship. Most people are not still in their first romantic relationship, which means it ended. And it probably ended in some kind of emotionally traumatic way. Maybe somebody lied to you. Maybe you got cheated on. Maybe you guys just recognized that you weren't compatible anymore. And whatever the fallout was of that relationship, especially if you were intensely in and attached to the relationship. So for most people, that means the longer the relationship was, probably the more trauma was experienced when it was ripped away from you, right? That's not an across the board assessment, but generally that's how it works. So the more attached you were, the more painful the traumatic ripping away of that relationship probably has been. And what that means for most of us is we tell ourselves, I don't want to experience this pain again. That's the trauma. How can I protect myself from ever experiencing this pain again? That's the protection. So most of us are operating on trauma protection patterns because most of our patterns have been created to protect us from trauma. And that's all learned. At one point in time, we didn't have almost any of our conscious, especially adult trauma protective patterns. We had the embedded human protective patterns, like just the normal human trauma, like we don't want to die and we want food. And, we learn how to cry and we learn how to use all of our behaviors when we're small kids to get what we're wanting. And that's a form of trying to avoid human trauma. But most of the stuff that most of us as adults and most of your coaching clients, if you're a coach, are dealing with is not that. It's the created human trauma protective patterns that were learned. These are behaviorally learned. So if that's the case, then, and I obviously believe it is, then we need to understand the effect of trauma, that it is literally everywhere. Like not 100% of our human experiences are traumatic, but most of them are. And most of the ones that we hold on to, especially if we create protection because of, those are all traumatic, right? We don't have a really good experience in life and go, wow, that was blissful and amazing. Let me protect myself from that ever again.
Right.
Unless there was already a previous trauma that told you you didn't deserve that.
Right.
And then that might be a whole different thing. But going back to this relationship example, if you had trauma in a past relationship, you created protective mechanisms probably that were designed to protect you from experiencing the same thing again. So maybe you lost trust with people. Maybe you became hyper aware, and maybe you became overly anxious. Maybe you became overly suspicious. Maybe because you didn't want to get cheated on again, you assumed everybody was going to cheat on you in the future because that's just going to be a repeat of the traumatic experience in the past. Therefore, you're going to make sure you never get cheated on. Or you might make sure that if you ever do get cheated on, it's not going to hurt this time because you're not going to put your heart into the relationship. So this is just an example that I think a lot of us can relate to of how we use our traumatic experiences to protect us in the future. But the problem is now we're walking around the planet experiencing all of our circumstances through our trauma protection. Where it's like we put on a bunch of layers to make sure that the rain doesn't get us. And it works because all those layers will stop the rain from getting us. But the sun can't reach us either, nor the breeze, nor anything that's out there in the weather that would actually be enjoyable because we've protected ourselves from the rain. And the sadness in that is the human who's been traumatized by the rain will stay coated up and suited up, will keep their raincoat on through all weather because we don't discern. We don't even look up and go, oh, it's not raining, therefore I don't need my raincoat. That's not how we do the human experience usually. So that working definition of trauma means that all of us are traumatized. The only difference is in the details. What was your trauma? What are your patterns? How deep is it? How is it manifested? Is it difficult for you to trust people? And not everybody responds the exact same way. There's a lot of similarities, but not everybody responds the exact same way. So even the same exact traumatic event won't necessarily produce the same protective patterns. So two people can experience divorce, but not necessarily put up the same protective patterns. And because of that, trauma is individual. We're going to talk about the overall general ideas of trauma, how it works in, what we're familiar with in terms of human transformation and all that. So as I say that, I'm going to put a pause in that. Trauma and transformation go together. And that's what I want to speak to here in a moment. So we're going to give you a lot of generalized understanding, hopefully, of trauma, but true trauma work can only be done individually if we're really going to create transformation in an individual human. And that's why you can't do this work on your own. The deeper the work you want to do, the more liberation you want to experience, the deeper the healing that you want to have, the more individualistic all of that is. And that's just the nature of the game. That's the nature of this human trauma game. So before I connect trauma and transformation, what is it that you want to say?
I appreciate you sharing the definition because I think it's really important. Most of us are unconsciously in denial, right? And many of us are consciously in denial, but I think a large part of the population is unconscious to the fact that they are traumatized. And if we're not aware of that, then we're not going to do anything. We're not going to seek support, right?
Well, because only victims are traumatized. So we don't want to admit that we're a victim.
Well, yeah, there's that. Yeah. And I think it's just important for us to understand that it really is the world and the environment that we live in. And so if we want to be able to have any control over it, it is important that we first, right, recognize, oh, hey, this actually does apply to me. Because we're not going to have any control or empowerment to change anything that we're denying the existence of, right? So I actually really love the very simple, I mean, for me, it's anything that is distressing or disrupting, right, to our expectations. That is traumatizing. And I love the terminology that you use. I've heard it referred to as big T trauma and little t trauma, which I like. And we talk about macro and micro traumas, right? And it's really important for us to understand that oftentimes the macro traumas, not always, but oftentimes they get the support because we're like, oh, this is a big deal and I need to get help with this because this was traumatic. But if we have so many series of these micro traumas that we're ignoring, over time, they can actually have as equal to, if not greater, impact on us because
Much worse.
Absolutely.
In my opinion, much worse.
Because they're operating without our acknowledgement. So we're not doing anything about it, except we're telling ourselves to push through. We're telling ourselves to work harder, to get our head on straight. We're telling ourselves to get over it. And we don't understand what's actually happening. And I think this happens a lot inside of the personal development industry, unintentionally. A lot of the like positive, oh, just like you can do it, persevere, that type of energy is actually really dismissive and not helping when we don't understand what's actually happening at the surface. And it makes sense because we're not trained to recognize it, right, at all, or to know how to address it or handle it within ourselves. And to what you said a moment ago, we don't want to be we don't want to think of ourselves and we don't want other people to think of us as victims. And then we end up self-shaming because there are people out there who have it worse than us, right? So what do we have to really feel bad about when the reality is that, the things you experienced in your baseball career, with your mom, with your children, with your wife, in school, with the accident, all of those things were traumatic.
Yeah. Well, I didn't give you permission to list all of my traumas like that. So
I gave you back what you said, but I did add in your
you.
baseball career.
Yeah, you added a couple things in there that I didn't say earlier. So thank you for just such a very quick, I guess it's all ripping of the Band-Aid concept, right? Is that what you're saying? So if you just slap me across the face super fast with all the traumas, like I can't even experience that one from over there because I'm already over here. So thank you. This conversation is massive and it requires a bunch of different discussions, I'm sure. So I'm sure there are going to be different videos on this. And I think we can break down, dissect what you just said in just one whole video. So let's put a pin in that one about the dismissiveness of a lot of personal development work. You're never going to, my experience, you're never going to affirmation your way out of human trauma. There are a lot of things that we do to change our mindset and calm our mind. And most of those things are useful. They're just not healing in the total realm. So this isn't an either or conversation. We're just saying certain things can work for this reason, but they're incapable of doing this. And there are a lot of things, probably the high majority of things that we're taught in the personal development world are not capable of addressing the trauma. So going back to this idea of micro trauma, stacked on top of itself, untreated, unrecognized, unembraced, is going to end up being way worse for many people, if not most people, than the macro traumas that are okay to embrace. Yeah. Because using this definition that we just put out, 99.9% of our experiences as humans don't fit the normal label of trauma. It fits all the other stuff. It fits micro traumas. And so if the majority of our human experiences are traumatic, but are not treated, then that's going to cloud everything. And that's why I say collectively, those are worse. Individually, of course, those deep, deep traumatic experiences, and please, nothing that we're saying is dismissing any of those experiences either. We're just putting them on a spectrum. And so to say that me moving as a child is traumatic and being abused is traumatic, that's not an exclusionary statement or a dismissive statement. I'm not saying, oh yeah, I've been traumatized too, just like you. So go ahead and handle your stuff like I handled my stuff. I want to be really clear. That's not what we're saying. We're just putting everything on a spectrum. And we're saying some traumatic experiences are incredibly deep and intense, and some of them are not. And they're all trauma to a degree using our working definition. So I hope that none of this is coming across as dismissive to anybody out there. And we don't know what all the other definitions of trauma are. So if there are credible sources out there that have talked about trauma and defined trauma, and this is what therapy or counseling uses, that's cool. I'm also not trying to replace or dismiss or invalidate any of that sort of stuff. But if we have a more inclusive definition of trauma, then we have more reason and more permission to address all of it. And that's going to lead to so much more empowerment, in my experience, again, over the course of the work. And the work, what we're talking about is transformation. So transformation is a process. It's not a finish line. It's a deep journey. And I think most people don't commit to or sign up for the transformational journey because of what their associations are to it. And that the association could be painful because I don't want to touch the stuff that I've been spending my whole life suppressing. That doesn't make sense to me. Okay, I get it. And or hopeless because I already did that and it didn't work. And so I think for most people, some version of those two things, and quite often a combination of those two things, is the reason why we avoid the path of transformation, because, as I said earlier, transformation includes trauma, meaning the transformational work includes trauma work. And the reason why is because once upon a time, very early on in our lives, we operated as a relatively untraumatized, and I'm making a distinction here. I'm talking about the emotional traumatization that most of us are dealing with as adults, right? Just being birthed is highly, highly traumatic. And we'll speak to that here in a moment. Actually, let me just go ahead and say that because I've talked about it a couple times now. If we look at the human experience of all of us as animals have an instinct to seek comfort and love and safety and life. And I'm not saying those are the only four things, but we have this deep primal instinct and commitment to be alive. And when we are swimming in our mother's womb, and like whether we still have a connection with our biological mother or not, all of us were created inside of a female womb. Inside that womb, when we were first being created and eventually growing limbs and eventually growing eyes, and, you know, a lot of those things that we see on the what is it, like 5, 6, 7 months in, the ultrasound machine, and like, oh, we can see the thing. Like, as we're forming for 9 months, roughly, give or take a few days or weeks or whatever, depending. But as we're growing, we're used to this environment that we're in because it's the only environment that we know. And even though we're not conscious and our brain activity isn't all activated and all this kind of stuff to the degree that we will be later on, we're learning, and we have an animal instinct, and we're figuring all this stuff out because we're trying to stay alive, and we are getting used to the way that we're getting nourished and the way that we are getting loved and the attention that we're getting and the warmth that we have, you know, that literally the temperature that we have inside our body, inside of the womb that surrounds us. All of that stuff is then violently broken during the birth process. Whether we are birthed naturally through the birthing canal, or we are cut open, you know, the mother's stomach is cut open and we are extracted. It's a traumatizing experience. All of a sudden we see these lights and we see all these things that we don't understand, and we hear these sounds that we don't know, and the temperature is different now, and people are touching us now, and like all of this stuff is such a highly traumatic experience to this little forming human. And to a large degree, we spend our early months and years just trying to recover from that trauma. We're trying to figure out, how do we get food? We never had to ask for food before. We never had to have food inserted into our mouth. We don't understand this thing. And what's this sound that comes out of my mouth now? What are these things that it can actually like there's so much newness that we're trying to stabilize ourselves with. And then we're learning language, and we're learning what happens. How can I control whether that human right there picks me up or not? And whether I get fed. Like, there's so much that's happening in the early years. And those are what I would call instinctual primal traumas, because they're based on survival. They're based on protection. They're based on food. They're based on primal need for love. All of that stuff is the animalistic trauma, I would say, at an animal level, that we all have inside of us. At a certain point in our lives, when we're 2, 3, 4 years old, we haven't been, a lot of us, I mean, we all have like a moment of the first, let's just call it adult trauma. Not that it necessarily has to come from an adult, but the stuff that we're going to deal with as adults and usually passed down by adults and what have you. Let's just call it the adult behavioral trauma. For some people, it is very, very early, right? You think of babies who are addicted to drugs, or babies who are born into a highly abusive and neglectful relationship, right? So there are absolutely behavioral traumas that happen like as soon as some people come out of the womb. And then other people can be born into this incredibly loving space, and you know, and it's everything that all babies want. At some point in time, that baby's going to be traumatized as well. It could be at 5 years old or 9 years old or year and a half or whatever. But my point is, at some point, there's like an original human behavioral trauma that we experience. And from that point, we spend basically the rest of our lives trying to avoid that again. And then we get hit with something else, just like you did to me just a few moments ago. Okay, I handled that one, but oh my goodness, what about this one?
Right.
And then, okay, I protected myself from that one, but holy crap, what about that one? So we then spend the rest of our lives to some degree, not literally every single second, although there's a piece of us every single second at the unconscious level that's doing this all the time. But in our behavioral evolution, we are spending so much of our time trying to protect ourselves from re-experiencing some trauma in the past. That process happens regardless of how intense that trauma is. If it's a minor level of intensity, then the protection is going to be minor. If it's a deep, deep trauma and highly emotional and consistent, and we almost died inside of the process, or we thought we were going to die, then the protection is going to match the intensity, basically, right? So what we're saying is the trauma process and how a human tries to get back up when they've been knocked down, if we just call that the trauma process, then we are living a trauma experience. And learning the trauma experience will help us find the balance and will help us feel the connection and will help us feel the love and do all that stuff. But because all the protection mechanisms were produced from traumas, then if we want to do any kind of deep work with ourselves or with our clients to remove some of those protective mechanisms that are now getting in the way of us living the life that we want to live, those are all trauma-informed mechanisms. Those are all fueled by trauma. So we can't say, I am going to get into the business of knocking down walls that are holding us back from the life we live. I'm going to knock down all these brick walls. I'm just not going to learn about bricks. How are you going to do that? How are you going to teach me without understanding the main ingredient in the process? So we need to understand that in our own personal journeys, that trauma is just a thing and we all experience it. It's not this, you know, you're a loser if you've experienced traumas, or you're vulnerable, or you're a weakling, or whatever, you're a victim. No. This is part of the human journey. So we need to expand, I think, our embracing of the idea of trauma, and then expand our awareness of it. And if you're so inclined and you want to be a transformational agent, then expand your skills inside of it. Expand your capacity to understand it. And those two things are going to go together. You cannot do the second one without doing the first one. You can do the first one without doing the second one, right? Like you can work on your own personal trauma for your own personal experience and never decide to become a coach for deep work, but you can't become a coach that's capable of doing deep work on any level without going through your own stuff, because it just won't, you know, you won't have the body for it. So let me wrap up just my thoughts here, and then I'll throw it back over to you. If we change our relationship to the idea of, the definition of, the existence of, the effect of trauma, our ability to change our behaviors are going to be exponentially expanded. Because we all know what to do and what we should stop doing. We all know that stuff. Never in all of my time in personal development has a human not actually known the majority of the behaviors. Like there might be scientific stuff that we don't know. But if you want to lose weight, do you really not know that you probably shouldn't eat Snickers, and you probably should exercise a little bit more, and you should probably do some of this stuff? If you really want to make more money, do you really not know that that means you got to reach out to more people, that you got to build stuff, that you got to do the things that are going to lead to the money? So pretty much all of us know the path to take. We're just resistant to the path. And so if we want to be leaders and really help people fundamentally change the processes that are operating in their life, then we have to be aware of, at the very least, the roots of the behaviors that we're wanting to help people change. Because if we don't know how to change the roots, it's literally like just clipping the weed above the soil that's just going to grow back because the roots weren't changed. And most of us are doing that in our lives. We're just trying to motivate ourselves to change patterns without addressing the seeds that produced all the patterns, which is a trauma conversation.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you just said that, because that's why it's important for us to understand that this is affecting us, right? Because we are in our society, we're just conditioned to plow through, to push through, to just like grind it out, right? To keep going.
Walk it off, rub some dirt on it.
Right. And just like and a lot of the personal development stuff that I read and heard early on, and I don't say this with judgment, it's just what I heard, was that I really could like willpower my way. And so I spent a lot of time really not understanding why I knew what to do, but couldn't do it. Right. I was like, I don't get it. Right. I remember sharing with you multiple times, I'm doing everything right. Right. I'm doing what they say to do. I'm saying the things, I'm pushing through, I'm persevering. I know what to do. I want to change. I'm clear that I need to change. And yet I can't change. And what became so clear to me just through my own work, but very crystallized recently, is that when we make these bold declarations to a system that is programmed and set up, I mean, for our protection, for our safety, it's terrifying. So it's not going to be like, oh, you want to do that thing now? Oh, fantastic. We'll just put all this stuff down that we've been protecting you from for your whole entire life. Right. And it's really important that we understand that. So you were speaking just a moment ago of the resistance. And I just want to be very direct to bridge that for our listeners, that resistance is the protection.
Right.
And it's important that we understand that so that we then get support and actually the thing that is going to help us, because we're not, unless you are in an individual situation where this applies to you. I will say the majority of us are not trained to slow down, to seek understanding, to approach with curiosity. We're trained in this culture to just power through and push through and get it done and make it happen. And this work requires the exact opposite. And the shift in awareness can open you up to the work that's really the work that's really going to actually make the traction to uproot the real issue versus just continuing to, pull out the weeds there at the surface. And the other thing I want to say, just to be really clear, is that a lot of people connect this type of work with therapy. And I know we've done a video on this, and I'll definitely make sure we put a card up here for everyone on like coaching, because coaches that are trained in this type of methodology absolutely can do that, like can work with trauma. And a lot of people don't realize that. A lot of people don't recognize that this type of work is possible when being done with a coach who is trained in how to actually help work with and help human heal trauma.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So for the sake of just time, let's end this conversation here, this piece of the conversation. But another thing that we want to get into, so make a note of this, put a little pin in it, is generational trauma.
Yeah.
How deep trauma goes well beyond our human experience just in this human lifetime. We'll talk about much bigger trauma, ancestral trauma, cultural trauma, gender trauma, and dissect some of that stuff in another video, because as soon as we try, it'll be another 45 minutes here.
Yeah, I'm gonna put myself on mute.
Yeah, exactly. So hopefully this has at the very least expanded your awareness. And again, if you want support with any of this stuff, if it's triggered anything for you, click the link in the description of this video. We offer free coaching, and we want to give you the individual attention that we know is required. And that could be for anything that you are currently experiencing in your life and you want support with, or it could be in your journey as a coach. If you are committed to transformational work, I mean, if you're watching this all the way to the end, then that tells me you're committed to being a transformational coach and not just an informational coach, which is nothing wrong with. But this kind of coaching is the scuba diving. And that's why this trauma conversation is so critical. So however you're going to implement it, be gentle with yourself. Be gentle with the process. Have compassion for the humans on the other end of their trauma, because we're all traumatized. And when trauma comes out of a human, or the protection comes out of a human, it comes out in anger sometimes, comes out in rage, sometimes it comes out in literal physical violence. It comes out in many ways, or sometimes it's aimed at self, and people start to punish self or abuse themselves and what have you. But that's all, it's all trauma. It's all the human's inability in that moment to manage the thing that they were taught they were simply supposed to avoid. And if you're taught to avoid something that you're not able to avoid, when it shows up, what are you going to do? Because you're not taught to do anything with it. So that's what I hope this conversation invites you into. Now, if you like this video, check out that video right there, where I will break down what it actually takes to build a successful transformational coaching business from the inside out.
I've yet to find a human that can't be healed, but I run into all the time, most of humans won't do the work to heal, and they'll spend the rest of their lives just numbing them